Hello, everyone. Welcome to another installment of our Standing Our Holy Ground webinar series about gun violence and what the church can do about it. Thank you for being with us today. This, if you don't know already, is a year-long webinar series that delves into the question what the faith community, sorry about my phone, can do about violence, gun violence. This is our 13th webinar in our series. And today we'll be having a conversation about the trauma recovery and rebuilding process in the wake of gun violence. Our webinar series is hosted by the Presbyterian Peacemaking Program in collaboration with our colleagues in the Presbyterian Peace Fellowship. My name's Carl Horton. I am the coordinator of the Presbyterian Peacemaking Program. And my colleague Simon Doon is monitoring our webinar platform to make sure everything runs smoothly. So before we move on, and once the telemarketer stops calling my house, we want to review the common understandings that we've developed and are following for this webinar series. If you've joined us before, you've heard these, but we want to review them. They set a nice baseline of understanding, they center our conversations, and they guide our discussion as we talk about this complicated issue of gun violence. So here they are. Gun violence is a public health epidemic that impacts our communities, congregations, and members, whether they know it or not. The impact of gun violence is disproportionate, affecting some individuals and communities often, and others seldom. We must first understand the impact of gun violence by listening to victims, survivors, and those who experience it. The gun violence prevention movement is not anti-gun. The Second Amendment does not preclude reasonable, sensible gun violence prevention legislation. Addressing gun violence will require changes in the legislation and culture of our nation. The Presbyterian Church has issued clear policy and strong statements on preventing gun violence, but true change requires action and advocacy by our members and our congregations. As people of faith, we must pay attention to the discrepancies between the teachings of our faith tradition and the messaging of media and special interest groups. The webinar series is an opportunity for constructive conversation and learning, and not for posturing and polarizing rhetoric that has characterized the gun violence debate. And finally, our panelists and participants in this webinar series demonstrate mutual respect, listen for understanding, and engage in a way that bears witness to the best values and practices of our faith traditions. So for those of you who are actually attending the webinar today and not viewing the recording, we do encourage you and invite you to ask questions of our panelists. We'll save a time at the end, God willing, for Q&A. And so throughout the webinar, we hope you will be posting questions. The way to do that is just use the Q&A tab in your Zoom window. You'll see that on your control panel. It helps us if you tell us to whom you are directing the question, or if it is to the panel as a whole. And we want to remind you, please use those common understandings as you frame your questions. So let's get to our panelists. They are a wonderful group today. We begin with Reverend Cecilia Cece Armstrong. She is a graduate of the Interdenominational Theological Center, where she attended Johnson C. Smith Theological Seminary and earned her Master's of Divinity. After seminary, Cece served Grady Memorial Hospital as a chaplain and Beth Salem Presbyterian Church, USA, as supply pastor. As an ordained teaching elder in the Presbyterian Church, USA, Reverend Armstrong served her first call as solo pastor of Grace Presbyterian Church, USA, in Lantana, Florida. Now, Pastor Cece is the very proud associate pastor of St. James Presbyterian Church, USA, on James Island in Charleston, South Carolina. Hey, Cece, I once served a St. James Presbyterian Church. So there's one on the West Coast too. So Cece, let's begin with you, and welcome. Thank you for being with us.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. I am truly excited about being with you. I currently serve, as you said, as the associate pastor at St. James in Charleston. And as I say it, on the lovely James Island. And here's the good news. I've been there for about 5 years. On June the 1st, it will be my 5th year anniversary. And so I've enjoyed being there. St. James has been around since 1866, and it is currently considered the largest African-American Presbyterian church in our denomination. And as a known African-American congregation, local racial issues and tension has always had a place in the social justice ministry of the congregation. The evening of June 17th, 2015 was no different. It was on June 17th, only 16 days after my arrival and 11 days prior to my installation, that the Mother Emanuel massacre took place. The city was on high alert because of the nature of this dreadful crime. The group of 6 women and 3 men who had come together for weekly Bible study were killed in this mass shooting at Emanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston. Now, there were others who were present and injured and traumatized, but that night, when these precious lives were taken, was also the night that I prayed to God asking, what have you called me to do in this? What was I supposed to do with this new call? It was truly overwhelming. Nothing in seminary had prepared me for this encounter. Nothing in seminary nor in clinical pastoral education would give me the answers needed to be a pastor in times of this type of crisis. The Reverend Clementa Pinckney was local clergy, so he had connections with the former head of staff and the former associate pastor of St. James, the Reverends Charles and Carolyn Hayward, through local clergy alliance groups. The 2 of them, would need a pastor. The Reverend Sharonda Coleman Singleton was the track coach for 2 young ladies who were in the youth group at St. James. Those 2 young ladies would need a pastor. And then one of Tawanza Sanders' best friends and business partners is a young adult who holds membership at St. James. He would need a pastor. These were the direct connections that I was made aware of within the week of the shooting. God was calling me to be their pastor in the time of a crisis. Reverend Patricia B. Jones, who was serving as an elder on the session at the time, worked for Charleston County Consolidated 911 Center as the terminal agency coordinator and was responsible for being the support to the support. Reverend Jones was responsible for providing emotional support to dispatchers and call takers in times of devastation. Her work included support for those involved in the shooting death of Walter Scott, which had taken place previously that year on April the 4th, and those involved with the Mother Emanuel massacre. God was calling me to be her pastor in the time of a crisis. And then another one of our session members, Elder Clarissa Whaley, worked as a court administrator with the Charleston County Solicitor's Office and U.S. Attorney's Office. Her responsibility included work for the Department of Justice, coordinating services for victims of crimes recognized at the federal level. Now, her line of work is too sensitive to divulge any details. However, she spent very intimate moments with victims from the mass murders at Mother Emanuel AME Church. God was calling me to be her pastor in the time of a crisis. Now, in conversation with God, because that's who I have a conversation with, I discovered the answer to my question. Who God has called me to be for such a time as this was made evident to me by the work I was being called to do. I did not need to be on the front lines with the many ministers who showed up at the church dressed in their collars to be sure to be recognized and noticed. I did not need to rub elbows with the state officials who would promote the necessity of an early forgiveness image while anger boiled in the deep-seated guts of those whose families were altered. I did not need to be near or around the spotlight. I did need to be readily available for those who needed a pastor. My confession was that I needed to find a way to be committed to the wholeness and well-being of all of humanity, male and female, and especially for those who were given to me in this charge. I needed to find a way to simply be. The spiritual support team was developed. This team was made up of several professionals across the state that participated in the much needed support for the families of the victims. Over the passing days, weeks, and months after the shooting, I participated on the SST. This participation allowed me to be a pastor for those who needed a pastor to walk this journey with them. I spent the bulk of my time with service to the children of one of the victims. Although I was new to the call, I was not new to letting God use me. The greatest thing for me to do was to turn to the scriptures and try to figure this thing out. And so I ended up in Mark chapter 2, verses 1-4. All I had was my faith, creativity, and commitment, just like the four in the biblical account. The man was a paralytic brought to Jesus by four friends, confident that Jesus did care and could heal. The four friends organized and actually dug through the roof of a home where Jesus was teaching in order to bring their mutual friend with an issue to Jesus. In my imagination, the four friends each had specific skills. One had to be an intervener who recognized that there was a severe problem, and one had to be a strategist who executed the plan for the solution. One had to be skilled with carpentry. It must have been a tactical worker with practical skills. And the last one had to be a full-fledged supporter who probably stayed with the paralytic the entire time, giving him the play-by-play account of what was taking place and being the encourager to keep the faith. My job was not to be the intervener who tackles the severe problem of systemic racism that sits at the root of many of the issues that paralyze the lives of Black and brown bodies. My job was not to be the strategist who develops and implements the solution for our judicial system that continually paralyze our communities with a lack of justice. My job was not to be the skilled carpenter or tactical worker with practical skills, because marching is great for those who can walk and stand and endure the elements. Plus, I wouldn't know how to tear a roof off anyway. My job was to be the full-fledged supporter, the encourager, the one who would hold the tissue when the times got rough for those who were in the fight. So I'm grateful today. I'm grateful to participate in a webinar like this, because the various roles of the four can continue conversation that leads to trauma recovery and the rebuilding process in the wake of gun violence. Our society needs to hear that there are sincere efforts to address the complicated issues of gun violence. I'm glad to be with you, Carl.
Thank you, Cece. It's good to have you here, and we appreciate your testimony around this issue. So excited to continue the conversation and give people a chance to ask you questions. We're going to move on, though, to hear from Jim next. Jim Kirk, a colleague of ours at the Presbyterian Mission Agency, is an ordained minister with the PCUSA, and in August of 2016, Jim accepted the position of Associate for Disaster Response in the U.S. for Presbyterian Disaster Assistance. Jim is a certified compassion fatigue professional, CCFP, through the International Association of Trauma Professionals and a member of the International Critical Stress Foundation. Jim was a volunteer with Presbyterian Disaster Assistance for over 20 years and is also a past chair of the National Voluntary Organizations Active in Disaster, VOAD, Emotional and Spiritual Care Committee. That's a mouthful, Jim. He has also been a national and local volunteer with the Red Cross for the past 12 years, since 2008. Jim was a part of a team that developed the Disaster Spiritual Care Program that is currently being integrated into Red Cross chapters around the country. Jim, welcome. We're really delighted you're with us today.
Thank you, Carl. I appreciate the introduction, and thank you to everybody who's on this webinar. And Cece, thank you to you. Thank you for giving a very powerful and faithful voice to something that is it's a terrible circumstance whenever it happens and wherever it happens. So thank you for what you did to bring comfort and hope and healing to those who were impacted by such a senseless tragedy. And I promise I'll give you credit, but you gave me some good ideas for a couple of sermons as I go on the road to talk about how we work together in disaster response. We don't all do the same thing, but together we bring people into the presence of Jesus. So I promise to give you credit. So in my role with Presbyterian Disaster Assistance, my responsibility is coordinating the domestic response to disasters. Of course, we think of the natural disasters that happen. In fact, CC was in an area that was impacted by a tropical storm today, but also to human-caused disasters. And that was something that came about for PDA in the late 90s. Our team of volunteers formed in the mid-90s, and we had kind of a one-size-fits-all for whatever disasters happened. And we had one person on our team who just had a vision and a passion and the wisdom to say that human-caused disasters are different. Yeah, there's some similarities. You'll hear perhaps a little bit more about that later in the webinar, but they're just different in some very meaningful ways. And CC, you've already outlined one of those ways, that an event like a mass casualty event, a shooting such as a Mother Emanuel, doesn't just impact those who are in that church or those who are in that congregation, but those who are in the entire community, because the entire community is impacted and the entire community needs to have a pastor. And that even goes further to the state and even to the country and to the world, as we know from many of these events. It has that kind of far-reaching effect. So we got involved in 1999 with the Columbine shooting. That was our first official deployment, if you will, to a human-caused disaster. And that was April 20th of 1999. And we were very rudimentary in our approach, but over the years, we did gain wisdom and experience, and it actually led to the writing of a book. And Bruce Wismer, who's on this webinar, is a co-author of that book, Recovering from Unnatural Disasters. And that's kind of a summary, if you will, of 20 years worth of doing this work and talking to people and sitting with pastors. So that's kind of how we've gone along. I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about why human-caused disasters are different in terms of the impact, the trauma, and that results from it. So Simon, I'm going to ask you to transition to a short video that kind of introduces this idea of why human-caused disasters are different.
We as a society, there's never been anybody alive that has witnessed more trauma than us, because of how much trauma we've imbibed since when we were children. One of the first things you see at a shooting scene, especially one that's unfolding, is media. And that gets transmitted to social media. And we start watching. Within 15 minutes, we have viral explosion of this into the consciousness of a nation and beyond. That is what you're calling a ripple effect, what I'm calling a contagion. The action of one person has infected hundreds of millions. And that happening day in and day out. How is media, gun violence and other forms of violence, how's that turning into symptoms for individuals and our culture? What's that do to a community, a city, a country, a state? Is it makes people more and more and more afraid. We are collectively perceiving a more dangerous world. Secondary trauma produces a perceived threat where there is no danger. A constant diet of imbibing trauma, fear-mongering, an intense increasing of anxiety and increasing of perceived threat.
Everyone's screaming.
And you can't do that without it impacting. It's gradual and cumulative. And what it produces is a state of chronic reactivity and symptom generation. And people who are trauma saturated, they can't hear anymore. They can't listen. They become polarized. It's us and them. which means that it needs to be addressed deliberately. It is an incremental, bipartisan, multiracial, all socioeconomic status problem. It pervades everybody. And the solution is in unity. Not unanimity, unity. Not everybody being the same. Everybody is welcome to their differences, but an amicable and deliberate process of starting to make things better with dialogue first, so that we can hear each other's sides of the fence without it producing so much polarization that we can't move it forward. You can't move it forward when you stay in polarization. It's stuck. It's in stasis.
Thank you, Simon. Some of you may recognize that clip. It is from a documentary that David Barnhart did through Presbyterian Disaster Assistance called Trigger. And I think that was perhaps even the very first or one of the first webinars in the Standing Our Holy Ground series. So there's a lot in that clip, but the one part of it that I'd like to pick up on in terms of how human-caused disasters are different is in terms of the exposure, particularly the media exposure. We live in a world where disasters in general, and in particular human-caused disasters, are experienced firsthand by anybody who has a smartphone or anybody on the computer. That doesn't always happen, but very often happens as people are on the phone, they're taking video as an event is taking place. And so Eric used the term, the viral explosion into our consciousness, the amount of times that we see over and over again a very horrific act of violence. And that makes human-caused disasters more impactful just because of the magnitude of the amount that we take into our system and constantly see. But other disasters have that component as well, media coverage. Certainly with a big event like a tornado or a hurricane, we see 24/7 media coverage about the event and the impact of the event. So another part of what makes a human-caused disaster more impactful is the intentionality of the act. We know a tornado happens because certain climactic forces come together, and that's the result of it. It's not intentional. It's not good or bad. It's just what happens in the world that we live. But not so with a human-caused disaster. In a human-caused disaster, one person or several people intentionally go out to inflict harm and damage and death on others for a variety of reasons. Sometimes people are targeted because of a group that they're a part of. Sometimes they're just in the wrong place at the wrong time. But the intentionality of it is incredibly impactful. The vast majority of human beings have a visceral phobic reaction to somebody who goes out to harm another person. In one of the groups that I was involved in Florida, I was involved with a local crisis intervention team, and they had a speaker come in who does a lot of research and study in the effects of trauma, particularly human-caused events. And he told us this kind of anecdotal conclusion from his data. He said that if you went into a room of 100 people, well-adjusted people, or typical normal people, and if you had a box and you opened up the box and you took out a spider and you threw the spider out in the crowd, he said roughly 10% of the people would have a very strong visceral phobic reaction where there would be significant stress and trauma in that person's life. And he said, 10% will do that. Most people get out of the way. Some people will pick it up and it becomes a pet. But he said if he were to do the same thing, bring out a box and take out a firearm and point it at the audience, roughly 90% of the people would have that kind of strong visceral reaction to somebody intentionally bringing harm about. And that leads to more trauma. The more kind of phobic or stressful our response, the more trauma typically results. So that's another part that makes this difference. And then the third is that I lived in Florida for about 28 years, and thankfully I lived in a situation where I had choices. If I was scared to death of hurricanes, probably Florida's not a good place to live. I might want to choose to live someplace else. Or if a tornado is something that weighs heavily upon our hearts, perhaps we have a choice to move or at least do some kind of mitigative work at our home to be safe from it. But what we're experiencing is that where can we be safe from a human-caused disaster? Church is a sanctuary, but it happens in church. Movie theaters are a wonderful place to go to unwind with family and friends, but they're not safe anymore. Concerts, Walmart, go right down the line. So the perception, and Eric brings this out in the clip, the perception that people have is that no place is safe, that they need to be on guard everywhere. And the more people are living in a stressful body, the more trauma they're going to experience, and the more need there will be for pastors and people of faith to stand beside them and help. Those are just three of the quick reasons why human-caused disasters are different in terms of the trauma that they inflict on people. The last thing I'll say then before we transition to Bruce is a word about what PDA does in terms of our response to human-caused disaster. We don't do a one-size-fits-all, but we have several different interventions that we can offer to a community. For instance, with Columbine, we brought everything. We brought print resources. We brought volunteers who went in and worked with local leaders, primarily faith leaders. And we brought in grants that were used locally to help with the response. Sometimes a big event happens and there's not a place for PDA. We always work in partnership with our mid-councils, and we always look to be invited in and for a specific place for PDA to be. CCU did say it well, that there's enough people with collars who are going to be at certain locations to do certain things. There's enough people who are going to be at the large events, and we don't need to do that. There's enough people to do that. But where there's a place for us to fit, we do come in at the invitation of a mid-council. In the case of Charleston, we were in touch with Charleston Atlantic Presbytery and discerned with Donnie and others that the local resources were sufficient to meet the needs that were apparent. And so we supported from afar with our prayers, but also through grants. We did award 2 grants to Charleston Atlantic Presbytery, one in the early stages that was used to help with the unmet needs, and then one, I think it was about a year later when the trial started, to bring in or to help support some emotional and spiritual care. What we look to do when we go in as Presbyterian disaster assistants is to care for the caregivers, to help the helpers, to support the people who are local, because CC's congregation needed CC. They didn't need somebody coming in from around the country. And so our role is to come in and provide the support for the local leaders, primarily the faith leaders. So we can come in with print resources. We can come in with consultation over the phone. We can come in with national volunteers who can meet with community groups, and we can come in with financial resources or not at all, depending on the need. So that's a little bit about what we do. Then the last word is that PDA is just one of the ministry programs of the PCUSA. Of course, peacemaking is represented here. We have the Office of Public Witness. We have racial equity and women's intercultural ministries. And so PDA brings one of the pieces to the puzzle of how to address not only the impacts of mass casualty events, human-caused events, but what can be done to mitigate or to lessen the possibility that such an event will happen. So we're part of a larger program within the PCUSA. So that'll be it for my part of it, and Bruce can share a little bit more specifically about what we do when we do get invited in.
Great, thanks, Jim. Let me introduce Bruce real quickly, and he is an author of a really wonderful resource that we do encourage folks to look into. Bruce G. Wismer is the Reverend Doctor and an ordained teaching elder in the Presbyterian Church USA. Bruce has served in ministry for 35 years, and currently he, along with his spouse Karen, they are co-pastors at Pine Shores Presbyterian Church in Sarasota, Florida. Bruce is a member of our national response team of Presbyterian disaster assistance. He's been involved in national and international disaster responses and has responded to both natural and human-caused disasters, including the subject of one of our previous webinars, the Sandy Hook Elementary School mass shooting in Newtown, Connecticut. He also responded to the Boston Marathon bombing in Massachusetts, the Pulse nightclub mass shooting in Orlando, Florida, and the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School shooting in Parkland, Florida. So Bruce is experienced in human-caused disasters. Bruce, welcome. We're glad you're with us today.
So thank you, Carl, and thank you for the opportunity to kind of share with you some of the wisdom that we have gained over the years in responding to the human-caused disasters. Now, growing up on the Southwest Florida side of Florida, I'm very used to the notion of hurricanes and the pre-disaster stage. The cone coming, the cone moving, the cone coming closer, the cone moving away. So there's a lot of pre-disaster. And what we found in the human cause that there was really no pre-disaster. There was event, and there was not any warning. And I kind of changed the language from there was no way to prepare for it. There was really no way to anticipate it. It just happened. The shooter came, the shooter murdered. So that was really one of our first big learnings about the difference between a phase and natural disaster and human cause. It simply was that there was no buildup, no pre-disaster. It was event. So as we kind of learned through experience, and it was all about experience, we kind of modeled our phases of human caused response after the phases of natural disaster, but there was some serious nuances as we experienced along. So, once the event occurs, and are generally what happens in this phase, and again, it's more for conversation than prescriptive, in the sense it kind of helps us understand how we respond as individuals, congregations, and community. So event happens, and in that first bit of life in the disaster, there is this heroic energy, and that's really what it is. And you can think about all the good people wanting to do something good, something helpful, and that energy just starts to move towards something. Potlucks, teddy bears in Newtown, something like 85,000 teddy bears were given. People need to do something, and there's really no judgment in that. There's just an awareness that after an event, people need to do something. And as we look at COVID now, my daughter works in the hospital, and she has not paid for her coffee since COVID because people want to do something. So as a faith leader, you just need to be aware that in the event, in the initial aftermath of the event, there's going to be a lot of energy to do something. And you kind of are going to have to manage your congregation, your community energy. And that's it's a good thing to want to be helpful. So that's really the first phase. The second phase moves into this kind of this time of going into disillusionment or grief. It's really the third phase on the chart that I'm using for today. And the big difference between natural and human is that natural, there's a more a direct line downward. So the grief is disillusionment goes very, very quickly. With the human cause, we seem to kind of slide down, and it's tedious and it's painful, and it's difficult to be a leader in this phase as we watch the people we love kind of slide into disillusionment. And one of the issues that we've learned is that nobody does it at the same time. So if you have 100 people in your church or 30 people, they're bouncing around all the time as to where they are in this heroic energy to disillusionment, and they may be bouncing back up with some more energy to be heroic because they can't deal with the grief. So there's kind of this bouncing around, which you have to pay attention to. And as one of the a spiritual leader, this is hard on you. We've learned that this is a really necessary time where faith leaders, the heads, need to be paid attention to. They need spiritual and emotional care because it's demanding, and you have to be able to deal with intense emotions during this phase down into disillusionment. So as we slide down, and if the truth be told, as the leader, you're the last one to get there, because people are going to continue to come to you. So you don't get to get there until you have to help other people deal with it. And again, that's why emotional spiritual care is necessary for you as a leader. So you can see at the chart, there's this dip upwards, and for us that deal with lament and the book of Lamentations, about halfway through the book of Lamentations, after all the spewing, all the pain directed toward God, in the verse, there's a verse in there about halfway through that says, "And yet you are God." There's where you are when you say, "And yet there is God." You have experienced the turn toward what we would call kind of like reforming. And here's the most conflicted time for the church, because everybody wants to do good things, create new things, new programming, and move forward because you have reached that kind of place. And as a leader, you're caught in trying to manage 8 good ideas, beautiful, faithful ideas. But you have to be able to manage that and to help get the energy directed to faithfulness in your congregation. Because if not, a good idea will not be able to be executed well if there is not the support necessary. So you're bouncing around, helping your leadership, your choir, your Sunday school class, figure out what's going to be reformed in us, what's going to be the way that God wants us to go after this horrific event. And so as a leader, you're kind of bouncing through there, and this is when you're gonna need, as a leader through this process, you're gonna need good companionship. You're going to need to have trusted colleagues that you're going to be able to share. I was at a deployment where, I was not as quite aware as much as I should be, and I heard pastors talk about what I didn't see, hear, know was was helpful. So I kind of addressed it, and I realized that I was doing harm because what they were saying was not what I was hearing. So those trusted companions during this reforming phase, when you're going up and down, bouncing around, is really necessary. So connection is going to be real important at this point, being able to trust folks to talk about. So then we kind of go through this whole process, and we go into the wisdom section, and that is life after death. It's the resurrection in however that new form takes for you as a congregation or community. Some beautiful moments occur because of you've kind of lived through what we call the valley of the shadow of death. You've been through it, you've walked through it, and you've gotten to the point where there's wisdom in living in a new kind of way. It's not really a new normal as much, we can say that, but it's more living with wisdom. So that's kind of how the chart flows, or it moves. It's a kind of it's a for conversation. So if and when the event occurs, you're able to kind of to keep everybody in kind of agreement with where it's going to go, not where are you, as much as this is how it's going to go, and this is how we need to go together. So that's really kind of the chart flow, and it's just really what we have learned through experience, and it has served a great purpose for us. And PDA is when we go out. This is kind of how we model our response when the event occurs. We're there simply to help stabilize, just to be able to do one step at a time. What goes next? Is it the Sunday sermon? Is it the next funeral? What is it that needs? We're there simply to be a helpful presence. There's no problem solving. There's simply colleagues who care for colleagues in a difficult and demanding and destructive event. We move into kind of like the next phase, could be 2 weeks, it could be later, on how to help with the energy to kind of say this is what we now have as part of our life. Ministry has changed. Life is different. And how can we be helpful to get that moving in a faithful and helpful way? And then we kind of do the disillusionment and grief, where we provide emotional and spiritual training and support. And there's some real good programs out there, experiences really more than programs, that helps us be able to deal with some of the issues. And then wisdom's really kind of the ability to follow up and to celebrate with you the integration of the new ways that ministry is being embodied in your faith community. So I think I'm just going to be quiet at this point and let Kathy move on before Simon gives me the fingers. So thank you.
And you only mean that, Bruce. He counts us down. So
That's correct. That's correct.
Okay, Kathy, we are delighted to have you. PDA is so well represented here, and it's great to learn about the work of PDA. So Reverend Kathy Riley, our colleague, is also a Peace USA minister whose primary calling has been interim ministry. Her first career, I didn't know this, was a clinical neuropsychologist specializing in aging and in Alzheimer's disease. A volunteer first with the Presbyterian Disaster Assistance National Response Team. In 2012, she then joined PDA staff in a temporary position in emotional and spiritual care in response to that hurricane season that we remember from 2017. So Kathy, thanks for being with us. We're excited to hear from you now.
Thank you, Carl. It's good to be with you. I'm going to take just a couple minutes so that we will have time for questions and responses. in our time together. And just highlight a couple things that Bruce and Jim and Cece have mentioned and alluded to, and how that plays into our work in ministry in emotional and spiritual care. The trauma of human-caused disaster, of gun violence, as we've heard, is profound, and we know that. And we also know that healing for most people who've experienced trauma does come. Most people do recover. Their natural healing resources, their local resources help them recover. We know that. And so when we enter into a time after a shooting or a human-caused disaster with an initial deployment, as Jim and Bruce have talked about, or a later deployment, when we come in 3, 6, 9 months later, or perhaps a year later, we know that healing has been happening, and we are entering in to walk alongside the folks who are healing, to facilitate that healing, and to give them some tools perhaps for resilience, for preventing compassion fatigue and burnout that they either don't know they have or haven't heard of before. So we really look to provide ministry of presence, deep listening in those early deployments. And if we come in 3, 6 months later to offer some support, we're going to have some conversations with folks who were there early on, so that we can be as knowledgeable and informed presence as possible. I think one of the things also that we've touched on is that what we see, of course, for people of faith is a questioning of faith that can come deeply and in very profound ways after any disaster, but especially one that was done by human intent. And we don't ever offer answers, but we do offer accompaniment for those who are struggling with those questions and those concerns. I think also because we come in as, when we're called in and when it's safe and we can stay and come back for long term, we can, with our ministries, help kind of normalize the fact that recovery does take time, that it's not over in a month or 3 months or 6 months, and that in the year mark after a shooting and a mass trauma, a lot of things come back up, and we can, if we're called in, be there during that time. The other piece I would mention is that there's re-traumatization that can occur with any shooting. So if I'm exposed to a mass shooting, I might have had an experience 5 years ago, and this one brings it back for me. Or as my friend in Dayton experienced when the shootings happened in the Oregon district, that was her first exposure to a mass shooting a mile from where she lived. She's been re-traumatized a few times by shootings that have happened since then. So we're aware of that in PDA and everyone who does trauma work. And we just keep that in mind and know that long-term recovery is important, and supporting people along the way wherever they are is kind of what we do. So I want to mention just a couple programs that we have and then turn it over for questions. Bruce and Jim both talked a lot about the early deployments that we come in within a couple of days, a couple of weeks. And with our programs and our emotional spiritual care retreats that we can offer, we have all-day programs, we have a half-day program to help people prevent compassion fatigue, understand what that is and prevent it, prevent burnout as they care for others. Also building their own resilience through half-day and full-day programs that are designed to offer respite and self-care and tools that they can use in their daily life to be as resilient as they can, both in responding to the disaster they've just experienced, but knowing it's not going to be the only one probably that they face. So those are some of the things that we offer. The other one I'll mention that we offered in Dayton is what we call How to Offer Disaster Emotional and Spiritual Care. So in that setting, clergy and chaplains in Dayton first had experienced the terrifically devastating tornadoes that happened in May of 2019, and then the Oregon shootings happened in August. And some clergy and faith leaders and chaplains realized we're not as equipped as we'd like to be to offer disaster emotional spiritual care. And so they called us and we offered a program for a group of people so that they could respond better in the moment and also if future disasters happened. So we call those, sometimes we offer blue sky programs. So we'll go in, there's no disaster, there's been no shooting, but people know it could happen in their community, and we can go in and help equip and prepare folks for responding and offering care should it happen to them. So I'm going to close there and just say thank you for the opportunity, and here for questions.
Great. Thank you, Kathy. And thank you to all four panelists. Let's take some time now and let me encourage folks who are viewing the webinar to go ahead and submit questions using that Q&A tab. We do have a few minutes for that, so I'm going to be watching for those. You know, one of the things that strikes me is you know, Kathy, you talk about re-traumatization and the anniversary, you know, that awakens. So if somebody's been through this process that Bruce, you outlined so beautifully in those 4 stages, I'm curious about the time frame for trauma recovery and then the re-traumatization. Cece, your experience in your community with did that happen with the folks that you worked with? Are there events that trigger, I don't like to use that word, it's a gun violence term, but that cause the sort of reawakening of the wound? And then I'm also curious about if any of you would speak to the distinction between when this happens in communities that rarely experience gun violence, as opposed to those communities where this just happens over and over again. Is the trauma and the cycle of trauma different in those contexts? And I have just any of you that could respond to that, those couple of thoughts. And then I'm watching for some other questions to come in.
Well, I'll mention in Charleston every year, the mayor, who happened to be on his way in right as all of this took place, every year since then has had some sort of gathering for a gathering for to remember the families, to remember the victims, to remember the event. And every year it becomes a production. And it bothers me because there were children who every year revisit this issue. And so since then, the children that I had direct contact with, they no longer live in this area. And so I think that's helpful because they've been removed. But for those who are remaining here, it's almost as bad as a scab. You know, it gets to heal and, you know, it's going to be a little crusty and a little ugly. And then, you know, June 17th roll around and we rip it off and start all over again. So it becomes just troubling in that respect. And so it's during those moments that I just sit with an open ear and wait, just to be present, to walk with and play my role.
Yeah, that's the ministry Kathy was talking about, of accompaniment, of just ministry of presence, not providing the answers to those questions. It does make me think about commemorations and anniversaries of these atrocities and how it is important to mark them. And we do say never forget. And I think as communities, we have to hold ourselves accountable to remember and say, this can't happen again, and then do something, of course. But it does occur to me that for those who have experienced the trauma, it is a way of ripping off that wound, opening up that wound again for re-traumatization. Those of you with PDA, I've always heard that PDA is the first to arrive. That may not be the case in mass violence events and in human-caused disaster, but I have heard first to arrive, last to depart. Can any of you speak to the length to which PDA has been present through a trauma and coming back again to assist a community? Does that happen with these mass shootings?
Yeah, I'll say a word to that, but first let me pick up a little bit of the conversation that just happened. There's a phrase that has often been used that what doesn't overwhelm you will make you stronger. And that's not necessarily true. what doesn't overwhelm you and you are able to integrate into your life narrative can make you stronger. And so I think, Carl, I think in response to part of your question before, in terms of how people recover or heal from this, it's very individualized and personalized. And a lot of it has to do with how you're able to frame and make meaning of the event that took place. And that's at a different pace for everybody, but it needs to happen. Time does not necessarily heal all wounds, but time that's used intentionally can heal all wounds. We more refer to PDA folk as being early responders. Again, because of our protocol and having to work in partnership with the mid-council, when something happens, we're not sending people out the door. When something happens, we're connecting with our mid-council leadership, our presbytery leadership, and discerning what is the best response, which sometimes is to get people there very early, which we've done in many cases. Sometimes it's a later intervention, or sometimes not at all. So we're early, but not always first in. And we are known for being the last ones out, certainly in the natural disaster, long-term recovery phase, but also in human cause. I know with Columbine, we were connected intentionally with that community for over a year. Bruce, you can speak to this more with your experience, but I think some of your formal engagements with communities have been in excess of 2 years.
Yeah, and even I would, in some cases, even longer. I we don't get to journey into wisdom very often. That's the celebration of the community's new life. But every once in a while, we get invited back to have that celebration. So it's been, and I don't really want to scare anybody, but it's been in some cases up to 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
Now it's not. I mean, it's it's a phone call every couple of months at certain points, but there's an ongoing necessity to journey with folks who are deeply impacted and trying to do really good ministry. And if we can be with that and be helpful, it takes a long time. And I'm not so sure, it's not even moving longer now, particularly, as we look at collective trauma or ongoing, like you asked, Carl, on, I'm not so sure the and yet gets to. You get to it. You just go back into, boom, another event, and you do heroic and you slide and you don't get the and yet. And we have a lot to learn on how to be able to respond to the ongoing nature of violence, gun violence, particularly in certain communities, where it's an area we need to learn a lot more about.
Yeah, unfortunately, the and yet is and yet another episode, another occurrence. You asked a question earlier, Carl, too, that does need to be addressed in this context. I was part of the deployment to Columbine, and we were with a group. I can't remember what the context was. I think it was a workshop talking about our experience in Columbine, and got some definite pushback about the nature of the way gun violence is portrayed. If something happens in a predominantly white suburban context, it gets coverage from morning till night, and yet there are victims of gun violence who are impacted and tragically killed every day. Right. In other communities, primarily of color, right, where it's not even news, but just accepted as the norm, which is tragic and wrong and not faithful. And that does need to be addressed, that it's not as tragic as some of these events are that get all the attention. All victims of gun violence need to be remembered and need to have a voice. And all gun violence events need to get us to act more faithfully in terms of what can be done that's reasonable and faithful and moral and just to address this epidemic.
Yeah. You know, we're out of time, but there is a question that came in that I think we should ask, and it's tangentially related to mass shootings, but it is violence against people of color. And I think in terms of the recent that was just in our news, the George Floyd in Minneapolis at the hands of law enforcement, I Can't Breathe, awakens all the trauma of Eric Gardner from several years past. And so we have that kind of re-traumatization. And clearly, Jim, you were talking about viral, this sense of viral explosion. These things captured on cell phones don't only impact a community, they ripple through the entire nation and tearing at our fabric and exposing certain things that need to be exposed perhaps, but it's painful. The question is about these sorts of traumas. Here in Louisville, we had a paramedic shot by police. And that's rippling through our community and making national news. Ahmaud Arbery, it almost looks like he's hunted. And so these are traumas. And I guess the question from one of our viewers today is to Cece as a pastor. And how does a pastor address these traumas? And sometimes, Cece, they're traumas that aren't happening in your community, but they are traumas to your people, to all people, because they hit us at the core, especially of who we are as people of faith. How would you answer? What do you do? How does a pastor address these?
Well, I think the bigger danger is to not address it. I think that's the biggest danger.
Right.
To let the media give voice to it, to let the social media do its display of it, and for a pastor to not say a word at all about it does more damage than it does any good. We need to acknowledge that these things are happening, and not if they're happening to us or only when they happen in our backyards, but acknowledging what damage is being done to the core of people, like you said, to the core of the environment. And then to begin that process of finding scriptures that preach to action. What can I do? What, the Mark chapter, the Mark text that I use allows about 4 different angles from which any person in any capacity can respond to anything. And so what you begin to do is empower people through their gifts. What are your gifts that will allow you to do that? Maybe you are an intervener that knows how to get into the basis of what's happening and begin to work with people there. Or maybe you're the supporter who just merely walks the journey and pastor alongside. But you find a way to empower people with the gifts that they have, and to encourage them that their gifts are valuable. Some people will tell you in a heartbeat, praying isn't doing anything and marching isn't doing anything. But if those are the gifts that the individual has to offer in the pastorate where you are, then you empower them to do more of that in the best ways that they know how. I think one of the tragedies is if we gloss over it, if we polarize it like it was said, there's a us and a them. Well, it's not happening to us, so we're not going to talk about it at all. That's the worst case scenario, because when we leave the church setting and gathering and all, we're back in society where these things are traumatizing to so many others that it's as if COVID, you put your mask on, but it's not because it's for protection for you. You put your mask on so that you can help protect others.
If you love your neighbor.
Yeah.
Yeah. Listen, I love that you said, turn to scripture. You are a consummate preacher, because I can imagine that for each of these stages of the PDA trauma process, there ought to be sermons in those. nested, and there ought to be, and I think for any trauma, what would it look like to have a sermon for each of those stages that a community goes through in the wake of this kind of trauma? So we do have to end. Man, thank you to our panelists. Actually, before I thank you, I want to make sure I put in a couple of plugs for these resources that you all are connected to. So we want to make sure you all know about the book that Bruce Wismer co-authored, Recovering, good, we have a slide for it, Recovering from Unnatural Disasters, great title, a guide for pastors and congregations after violence and trauma. The book provides step-by-step suggestions that help pastors and church leaders to use with their communities recovering from these unnatural disasters like gun violence, suicide, or sexual abuse. And it is available from our publisher, Westminster John Knox Press, but you can also get it on Amazon. Want to also note that PDA has a series of training videos about trauma and pastoral care. The series includes 15, wow, videos intended for pastors caring for those experiencing trauma or experiencing trauma themselves and addressing a variety of topics. And the long URL right there, if you all want to scribble that down quickly, that's where you can find the series. Kathy, I'd love to hear more about your Blue Sky program, but I may talk to you separately about that. That's great preventative, or not preventative, but preemptive, helping folks be prepared, giving us skills. All right. We want to remind those of you who are with us that we have another webinar coming up on June 9th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. It is titled Too Close to Home, Guns and Domestic Violence. We'll be discussing the relationship between firearms and domestic violence and the many gaps in current legislation that must be addressed to protect victims and survivors and prevent future incidents of domestic violence. We have a stellar lineup for the next one too. Lisa Geller, policy analyst at the Educational Fund to Stop Gun Violence. Ruth Glenn, the director and CEO and president of the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence. And Shannon Frattaroli, professor at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. You will not want to miss that webinar. And to register for it, you just go to our Standing Our Holy Ground webpage, and you can sign up, and then you'll get helpful reminders that that webinar is approaching. So really, thank you to CC Armstrong, Jim Kirk, Kathy Riley, and Bruce Wismer for being with us today and helping us understand the trauma of gun violence and the recovery, and really grateful for PDA and for pastors like CC who are present in communities that have experienced this kind of trauma. So thanks for being with us today. Thank you to all of you who are viewing, and until our next one, goodbye and be well.